The air in the northern spire tasted of old iron and colder stone. Each gust of wind that rattled the arrow-slit windows carried the scent of pine and impending snow, a lonely, wild perfume that did little to mask the suffocating tension within its walls. Rhea Lorne felt the weight of it in her bones, a pressure that had nothing to do with altitude and everything to do with the secret locked away in the tower's highest chamber. They had told her the Alpha King was gone, that only a man remained, but the silence that coiled around this place felt heavier than any crown, more dangerous than any beast. It was the sound of a god holding his breath. She clutched the leather-bound book to her chest, its familiar weight a useless anchor in a sea of dread. Her knuckles were white, her palms slick with a nervous sweat that she prayed the regent, Lord Valerius, could not smell. He walked a pace ahead, his back a rigid wall of gray wool and authority. His scent was sharp, like flint and winter frost and alpha in perfect icy control. He did not look back, his heavy boots echoing a funereal rhythm on the flagstones. "The rules are simple, scholar," Valerius said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the narrow corridor. He didn't bother to turn, his words thrown over his shoulder like scraps. "You will refer to him as Lord Marrow. His memory of the last decade is fragmented. He believes he suffered a severe head injury during a hunting expedition in these mountains. You will do nothing to contradict this narrative." Rhea swallowed, her throat dry as dust. "I understand, my lord." "Do you?" He stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, bored into her, stripping her down to the meek omega she was. She flinched, instinctively wanting to lower her gaze, to make herself smaller. There will be no talk of the territories, no mention of the conclave, the treaties, or the blood moon accords, and under no circumstances are you to utter the words wolf, shift, or pack. To him, they are meaningless. Let them remain so. Each forbidden word was a cornerstone of her existence. To not speak of the pack was like being told not to breathe. It was the ultimate blasphemy, the ultimate lie. His wolf, she dared to whisper, the question escaping before she could stop it. Valerius's expression hardened, lines deepening around his mouth. His wolf is silent, dormant. The royal healers believe the ritual's failure severed the connection. He is, for all intents and purposes, human. He said the word human, as if it were a terminal diagnosis. Your purpose here is to keep his mind occupied. Read to him from the histories, the ones predating his reign, of course. Talk to him of cartography, of ancient poetry. You are a scholar. Be one. You are nothing more than a calming distraction, a pleasant, quiet presence to aid in his convalescence. A disposable one, she heard in the unspoken space between his words. An omega with her nose in books posed no threat. She had no ambition, no political alliances. She was safe. She was forgettable. He led her to a massive iron-strapped door, flanked by two guards whose stillness was more unnerving than any open threat. Their eyes glowed with a faint, predatory light, and the air around them hummed with the contained power of their wolves. They watched Rhea with open suspicion, their nostrils flaring as they scented her fear. "He grows agitated easily," Valerius warned, his hand on the heavy iron latch. "Frustration leads to anger. We cannot afford his anger. Keep him calm, Rhea Lorne. The stability of this kingdom depends on the silence within that room." He pushed the door open, revealing a chamber that was less a royal suite and more a gilded cage. The room was vast, dominated by a towering arched window that looked out onto a panorama of jagged, snow-dusted peaks. The air inside was different still, but charged with a strange electric quality, like the moment before a lightning strike. It smelled of wood smoke, old parchment, and something else entirely. Something deeply masculine and wild, yet muted, like a memory of a scent rather than the scent itself. Pine and storm and lonely earth. And there he was. King Alden Marrow, the Iron Wolf of the North, stood with his back to them, staring out the window. The stories had not done him justice. He was taller than she had imagined, his shoulders a testament to a power he no longer knew he possessed. A simple linen shirt did little to conceal the coiled muscle of his back and arms. His dark hair was shorter than in the official portraits, slightly unkempt. He was a statue of a king, magnificent and terrifyingly still. Rhea's heart hammered against her ribs. a frantic drum against the room's oppressive silence. This was the man who had single-handedly dragged the warring clans into a unified kingdom. The Alpha, whose roar was said to shake mountains. The shifter who could command loyalty or death with a single glance from his molten gold eyes. Valerius cleared his throat. "Lord Marrow, your new companion has arrived." Alden turned slowly, and Rhea's breath caught in her throat. The face was the same as the one on the coins and tapestries, the strong jaw, the proud brow, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. But the eyes were all wrong. They were not the burning gold of an Alpha king. They were a deep, clear brown, startlingly human, and filled with a profound, aching emptiness. They held confusion, not command. Suspicion, not certainty. The fire was gone. He looked at Valerius, then his gaze shifted to her. It was sharp, intelligent, but it lacked the primal weight of an Alpha's assessment. He wasn't reading her scent, her posture, her very soul. He was just a man, looking at a woman who had entered his room uninvited. "Companion?" His voice was a low, baritone, smoother and quieter than the gravelly roar of legend. The commanding rumble that could bring 1,000 wolves to their knees was absent. "I was not aware I required one." "Miss Lorne is a royal scholar, my lord," Valerius said smoothly. "She is here to assist with your studies during your recovery, to read to you, to provide conversation." Alden's gaze swept over Rhea again, and she felt a flush of heat crawl up her neck. He was taking in her plain woolen dress, her nervously clasped hands, the heavy book she used as a shield. "A scholar," he repeated, the word tasting like disbelief. He took a step forward, and despite herself, Rhea took an involuntary step back. A flicker of something. Annoyance? Hurt? Crossed his face. He stopped. "It seems my companion is afraid of me. Was my hunting accident so gruesome it turned me into a monster?" "No, my lord," Rhea whispered, finding her voice. "It came out thin and reedy. Forgive me. I am unaccustomed to such appointments. Then we have that in common." He gestured vaguely to the room, to the window, to himself. "I am unaccustomed to any of this." He walked over to a heavy oak table littered with maps and loose pages, running a hand through his hair. The gesture was so unguarded, so deeply human. It made Rhea's heart ache. He seemed more like a prisoner than a patient. Valerius gave her a sharp, warning look before backing out of the room. "I will leave you to get acquainted." The heavy door boomed shut, the sound of the bolt sliding home an echoing finality. She was alone with him. The silence that descended was thick and suffocating. Alden didn't look at her again. He picked up a star chart, his brow furrowed in concentration, but she could see he wasn't truly reading it. His knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the parchment. He was a wolf in a trap, and he didn't even know what a wolf was. Rhea's gaze drifted over him, cataloging the changes the legends never mentioned. The way he moved now was different, all human angles and restraint, none of the fluid, predatory grace that was the birthright of their kind. She could see the faded lines of other scars on his forearms, pale silver against his tanned skin. Battle scars. He probably thought they were from childhood tumbles or tavern brawls. He had no memory of the enemies he had slain, the wars he had won. He finally spoke, his back still to her. "That book you're clutching. Is it meant to be my first lesson?" There was a bitter edge to his tone. She glanced down at the volume in her hands. The Annals of the First Men, a history so ancient it predated the shifting curse itself. It was a safe topic. "It is, my lord, if you wish." He turned, leaning back against the table and crossing his arms over his powerful chest. "Tell me something, scholar. What do they say happened to me? The truth, not the regent's polished version." Rhea's blood ran cold. "My lord, I was told. A fall. From a horse. During a hunt." The lie felt like acid on her tongue. He watched her, his human eyes unnervingly perceptive. "A fall," he mused. "And yet, I have no memory of horses. I feel no fondness for the hunt. When I look at those mountains, I feel trapped, not liberated." He pushed off the table and began to pace, his long strides eating up the space in the room. He moved like a caged panther, all coiled energy with no release. "I have these flashes, images, The smell of burning leaves, the taste of blood, the feeling of running. He stopped, looking down at his own hands as if they were foreign objects, running on 4 feet. Rhea froze, her heart seizing in her chest. He shook his head, a humorless laugh escaping him. Madness, isn't it? The healers say they are phantoms of the mind, tricks of a damaged memory. He finally looked at her, his gaze intense and searching. But they feel more real than this room, more real than the name Alden Marrow. He was closer now, only a few feet away. The muted scent of him was stronger here, that ghost of pine and storm. It called to something deep within her, a primal instinct she had spent her life suppressing. The Omega in her recognized the Alpha, even if the man himself did not. His frustration mounted, radiating from him in palpable waves. He slammed his fist down on the table, making a stack of books jump. "Gods, this cage!" he roared. And for a split second, a flicker of something else was there, a phantom rumble beneath the human anger. The windows seemed to rattle. He spun around, his breathing harsh, his eyes wild with a fury he couldn't place. "I apologize," he grated, turning away from her as if ashamed of his outburst. "I lose my temper," acting on an instinct she didn't know she possessed. Rhea moved forward. She knelt to pick up the books he had scattered, her hands trembling. "It is understandable, my lord. To be lost in one's own mind must be a prison indeed." As she reached for the last volume, his hand shot out to grab it at the same time. Their fingers brushed. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. It wasn't the searing fire of a fated bond, but a spark of pure, undiluted connection, heat and life, and a sudden, shocking awareness. He snatched his hand back as if he'd been burned, his breath hissing between his teeth. He stared at her, truly stared, his anger forgotten. His gaze dropped from her wide eyes to her mouth, then back up again. The air thickened, charged with a new kind of tension. "Are you afraid of me, scholar?" he asked, his voice suddenly quiet, stripped of its earlier frustration. She looked into his lost human eyes and found herself speaking a sliver of the truth. "No, my lord," she whispered. "I am not afraid of you." He took a step closer, erasing the small distance between them. He was so tall she had to crane her neck to look up at him. The scent of him enveloped her, a dizzying, confusing mix of dormant power and raw humanity. He lifted a hand, not to touch her, but to gently trace the worn spine of the book she still held, his knuckles a breath away from her own. His gaze was locked on hers, a dark, searching fire igniting in their brown depths. "Valerius told you to lie to me," he said, his voice a low, dangerous murmur that vibrated straight through her bones. It was a ghost of the Alpha he had been, a predatory cadence that she recognized from whispered legends. "He told you to keep me calm, but your heartbeat, it doesn't lie." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was for her alone. "What is it that you're not telling me, little scholar?" His question hung in the air between them, sharp and heavy as a guillotine's blade. Rhea's heart, the very traitor he'd just named, hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Her every Omega instinct screamed at her to submit, to lower her eyes and murmur an apology. But the man before her wasn't issuing an Alpha's command. He was making a human plea, a desperate search for an anchor in a sea of forgotten time. And it was that raw, aching vulnerability that gave her the courage to stand her ground. She forced herself to meet his intense brown eyes, keeping her own voice impossibly steady. "Lord Valerius told me you suffered a great trauma. He said your mind, in order to protect itself, has walled off certain memories." She chose her words with the precision of a scholar dissecting an ancient text. "My purpose is not to lie to you, my lord. It is to help you build a bridge back to yourself, using the histories and knowledge that came before the accident." It was a masterful deflection, weaving the truth, a lie, and her prescribed purpose into a single, plausible tapestry. For a moment, she thought he would see through it. His gaze narrowed, searching her face for any crack in her composure. The ghost of the Alpha King was there in that scrutiny, the strategist weighing an opponent's defense. But then, the tension in his shoulders eased almost imperceptibly. He let out a long, slow breath, a sigh of profound weariness that seemed to carry the weight of his lost kingdom. "A bridge," he repeated softly, the words tasting strange in his mouth. He stepped back, breaking the intense proximity that had stolen the air from her lungs. A very long bridge, it would seem. He gestured to a pair of high-backed chairs near the hearth, where a low fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. "Well, scholar, if you are to be my guide, you had best begin the journey." Relief washed over Rhea so intensely her knees felt weak. She moved to the indicated chair, her movements stiff and deliberate. She sat on the edge of the velvet cushion, placing the heavy tome on her lap. Alden took the opposite chair, not relaxing into it, but perching on the edge as if ready to bolt. He didn't look at the fire. He looked at her, his focus absolute, his silence an unnerving weight. She cleared her throat, the sound ridiculously loud in the still room. She opened the book, the scent of dry parchment and aging leather a small comfort. "This is the annals of the first men," she began, her voice gaining a bit of its usual academic confidence. "It chronicles the settling of these lands, long before the great families were established. It speaks of the mountains themselves as living things, of the rivers as their veins, and the deep woods as their heart." As she read, something miraculous happened. The tension in the room began to dissolve, replaced by the cadence of her voice and the ancient words on the page. She spoke of legendary figures, Kalen the Stonebreaker, who carved the first mountain pass with his bare hands, Lyra of the Whispering River, who could navigate the entire northern continent by the sound of the water. These were stories from a time before their kind, tales of pure human grit and a deep intuitive connection to the land. Alden listened, rapt. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on her face. He wasn't just hearing the words, he was absorbing them. When she described the biting wind of the dragon's tooth peaks, he rubbed his arms as if feeling a sudden chill. When she read of the deep, dark forests of the Shadowfell, his nostrils flared, as if trying to catch a scent that hadn't existed for 1,000 years. The man was a ghost in his own life, and these stories of foundation, of beginning, were the first solid things he had been able to grasp. Rhea realized with a pang of pity and terror that Valerius's plan was both cruel and brilliant. They were giving him a history, just not his own. They were rebuilding him from a foundation of lies. Days bled into one another, marked only by the changing light through the great window and the delivery of their meals by a silent, grim-faced guard. Their routine became a quiet ritual. Rhea would read, and Alden would listen. He began to ask questions, his mind sharp and inquisitive. He wanted to see the maps she spoke of, his long fingers tracing the faded lines of rivers and mountain ranges. "This pass," he said one afternoon, his finger hovering over a treacherous route marked on an old map. "The historian claims it's impassable in winter. He's wrong. If you follow the lee of the ridge, the wind scours the snow. It's a clear path." Rhea stared at him, her blood turning to ice. How could you know that?" He looked up, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He pulled his hand back from the map. "I don't know. It just seems logical." But it wasn't logic. It was instinct. The instinct of a wolf who knew his own territory. A memory buried not in his mind, but in his very blood. The small moments of intimacy were the most dangerous. One evening, as she was reading a passage about ancient scripts, he leaned closer to look at the illustration in the book. He was so near she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell that faint, lingering scent of pine and a coming storm. His shoulder brushed against hers, and the contact was electric, a jolt of awareness that made her stumble over a word. He pulled back slightly, but he didn't move away. "Your voice," he said quietly, his gaze on the page but his attention clearly on her. "It's soothing, like rain on a tin roof." Her heart fluttered. No one had ever said such a thing to her. She was Rhea the scholar, the quiet Omega, the one who was more comfortable with books than people. She was plain, she was overlooked. But this man, this broken king, saw her. Another time, while she was poring over a text, she smudged a line of ink with her finger. She muttered a quiet curse under her breath, a sound of pure frustration. A scholar's battle scar? Alden's voice was laced with a gentle amusement. Before she could react, he reached across the small space between them. His fingers, warm and calloused, gently took her hand. He turned it over, his thumb stroking softly over the black smudge on her index finger. The touch was feather light, yet it seared her skin. It was a simple, profoundly human gesture, yet it sent a shiver of primal awareness through her entire being. The omega in her sighed in contentment. The woman in her trembled. "It will fade," he murmured, his eyes holding hers. The world seemed to shrink to the space of that single touch, to the warmth of his skin against hers, to the lost look in his brown eyes. He held her hand for a second too long, a silent acknowledgement of a connection that neither of them was supposed to feel. He let her go as if suddenly remembering himself, a faint flush rising on his cheeks. That night, sleep did not come easily to Raya. She lay in her small cot in the antechamber, the phantom, sensation of his touch still tingling on her skin. She was breaking every rule Valerius had set. She was supposed to be a calming distraction, a living book. Instead, she was becoming a confidant, a companion, and she was beginning to care for the man, not the forgotten king. She was falling for the gentle prisoner in the gilded cage, and that was a betrayal of the highest order. The turning point came during the second week. The moon was waxing, growing heavier in the night sky. Rhea could feel it in her own blood, a familiar restlessness, a subtle pull. She wondered if he felt it too. Did some forgotten part of him stir in its sleep? That evening, she chose a passage from a different section of the annals, one that detailed the great beasts that once roamed the lands. She read of dire cats with teeth like sabers and great bears that could topple ancient oaks. Then she came to the entry on the great wolves of the north. She hesitated, her throat suddenly tight. The word wolf was forbidden, but this was history, myth. It wasn't about him. "What is it?" Alden asked, noticing her pause. "Did you lose your place?" "No, my lord," she said, making a decision. "The next entry is mythological." She began to read. She described a beast of legend, a creature of immense size and power, with a pelt the color of shadow and eyes like molten gold. She spoke of its intelligence, its loyalty to its own, its ferocity in battle. She called it the Shadow Fang, carefully avoiding the forbidden word. Alden was unnaturally still. As she spoke, he closed his eyes, his breathing deepening. A muscle in his jaw began to twitch. "It was said," Rhea read, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "that the beast did not have a single heart but two, one that beat for itself, and one that beat for the pack, a rhythmic drum that bound them all together." A sharp gasp escaped Alden's lips. His eyes snapped open, wide with shock and pain. He lurched forward, clutching his chest with both hands, his face pale. "My lord?" "Alden," Rhea cried, forgetting all protocol. She rushed to his side, her book falling forgotten to the floor. "My chest," he grated, his voice tight with agony. "It's burning." He looked up at her, his human brown eyes clouded with terror and a profound, terrifying confusion. He grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong, desperate. "The story," he rasped, his knuckles white where he clutched his shirt. "What you said, about the two hearts." He stared into her eyes, and she saw a flicker of something ancient and wild stir in their depths, a shadow moving behind the curtain of his lost memory. "Rhea." He breathed her name for the first time, a desperate, broken sound. "Help me. It feels as if my heart is beating for two." Panic, cold and sharp, seized Rhea. Her mind screamed Valerius's rules at her: keep him calm, no agitation. The stability of the kingdom depends on. She had failed. She had read the forbidden passage, spoken the forbidden truth, and broken the silent king. The guards outside would hear. They would burst in and find him like this, find her at the center of his collapse, and she would be dragged from the tower to a fate she dared not imagine. But Alden's fingers were digging into her wrist, a desperate anchor in a storm she had unleashed. The terror in his human eyes was not that of a king, but of a man drowning in his own skin. And in that instant, her fear for herself was eclipsed by a fierce, protective urge that came from a place deeper than obedience. "Breathe," she commanded, her voice a low, urgent whisper. She dropped to her knees before him, prying his hand from her wrist and placing it, along with her own, flat against his chest where he had clutched the fabric. "With me, my lord. Breathe." Beneath their hands, his heart hammered a wild, chaotic rhythm. But there was something else, too. A faint, deep thrumming, an echo of a beat that wasn't quite there, like a drum being played in a distant valley. The second heart. The wolf's heart. It was sleeping, but it was dreaming. "I can't," he gasped, his body trembling. "It's tearing me apart." "Look at me, Alden," she said, using his name again, a desperate plea. "Not at the pain. Look at me." His wild, confused gaze finally locked onto hers. She held it, pouring every ounce of her own calm into the connection. The omega in her, the part trained for centuries to soothe and nurture, rose to the surface. It was an instinct she had always buried beneath layers of books and ink, but it was there. "Tell me what you see," she urged, her voice soft but firm. "You," he managed, his breathing still ragged. "No, out the window. Tell me what you see." He dragged his gaze from her face to the massive arched window. The sky outside had turned a bruised purple gray. The sharp peaks of the mountains were dissolving into a heavy descending mist. "Clouds," he said, his voice strained. "A storm is coming." "Yes. And can you smell it?" she prompted, keeping her hand pressed firmly over his on his chest, grounding him. "The air is changing. It will rain soon." He drew in a shuddering breath, then another. His nostrils flared. The primal, animal part of him, the part that was stirring in its slumber, responded, even if his human mind did not. "Yes," he whispered, a note of wonder cutting through his pain. "It smells clean, like wet stone and earth." "That is the scent of rain," she said, her voice a low murmur. "It is real. It is here. The fire in the hearth. Feel its warmth? The stone beneath your feet. It is solid. This is real. The pain is a phantom, a memory. It cannot harm you." She guided him through it, breath by breath, sensation by sensation. The scent of the coming rain, the crackle of the fire, the weight of her hand. Slowly, achingly, the trembling in his body began to subside. The frantic terror in his eyes receded, replaced by a profound, soul-deep exhaustion. He slumped back in his chair, his head falling against the high back, but he did not release her hand. His fingers were still entwined with hers on his chest. The phantom thrumming beneath their palms quieted, retreating back into the depths. The crisis had passed. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the rising wind whistling through the stone crenellations and the soft crackle of the fire. Rhea remained on her knees before him, their joined hands a silent testament to the barrier they had just crossed. She should have moved away, retreated back to her role as the quiet scholar, but she couldn't. To do so would be to sever a connection that felt more vital than any rule. Finally, he spoke, his voice hoarse. "No healer has been able to do that." He looked down at their hands, then up at her face, his expression one of dazed awe. "They give me potions, draughts that dull my mind and steal my hours. But you chase the ghosts away." "I only reminded you of what was real," she whispered, her gaze falling to the floor. She felt a flush of shame and fear. She had used a truth to sell a larger lie. "You are real," he said, his voice raw with a new, startling sincerity. He squeezed her fingers gently. "Your presence in this room, it's the only thing that feels real." He pulled his hand away from his chest, but he kept hers, holding it in his lap. "Tell me, Rhea, what do you see when you look at me?" The question was a trap. "I see an alpha king stripped of his wolf. I see the most powerful man on the continent, reduced to a prisoner. I see the lie we are all forced to live." She lifted her head, meeting his gaze. She chose another truth. "I see a man who is fighting a battle no one else can understand. I see a man who is stronger than he knows." A sad, small smile touched his lips. "A man who can be brought to his knees by a story about a mythical beast." He shook his head, a shadow passing over his features. "That feeling, the two hearts, I've felt it before. In dreams, I dream of running through the forest, the wind in my fur, the earth flying beneath my paws." He trailed off, looking at her with a desperate hope. "The healers say it is nonsense. What do you say, scholar?" Here it was, the precipice. She could pull back, retreat into Valerius's cage of silence, or she could step off the edge with him. "I say," she began, her voice barely audible, "that some myths are echoes of a truth the world has forgotten." His eyes widened, and he leaned forward, hope and desperation warring in his expression. "Then you believe me?" "You don't think I'm mad?" "I do not think you are mad, my lord." The first fat drop of rain hit the window pane, a dark star against the gray light. Then another and another. Within moments, a downpour had begun, the wind driving sheets of rain against the thick glass. The storm had broken. A low rumble of thunder echoed through the mountains, a sound so deep it seemed to vibrate up through the tower's very foundations. Alden flinched at the sound, but it wasn't a flinch of fear. It was one of recognition. He looked towards the window, his gaze distant, his grip on her hand tightening unconsciously. "That sound," he murmured. "It calls to something in me." They sat in silence as the storm raged, the room growing darker. The firelight cast their faces in flickering gold and deep shadow. The intimacy of the moment was overwhelming, a fragile bubble in a world of lies and danger. He had not let go of her hand. It was no longer a gesture of desperation, but one of quiet, essential connection. Rhea felt the change in him, in the very air around them. The restless, caged energy he usually carried had been replaced by a heavy stillness. He wasn't pacing, he wasn't agitated. He was simply present. With her, he trusted her. He turned his gaze from the storm-lashed window back to her. His thumb began to stroke the back of her hand, a slow, rhythmic gesture that sent shivers up her arm. His eyes in the dim, fiery light seemed darker, deeper. "Stay," he said, his voice a low plea. "When the guard brings the evening meal, don't go to the antechamber tonight. Stay here." It was the most dangerous request he could have made. To be found in his chambers after dark was unthinkable, a breach of every protocol. It would be seen as a transgression, an overreach. Valerius would have her removed in an instant. But looking into his lonely eyes, seeing the silent plea for one night free from the ghosts that haunted him, she couldn't refuse. Her own heart, the one that had only ever beaten for dusty tomes and forgotten histories, was beating now for him. "I will stay," she whispered. His relief was a palpable thing, a wave of warmth that flowed from him to her. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, achingly chaste kiss to her knuckles. It wasn't the kiss of a king to a subject, or a man to a lover. It was a kiss of gratitude, a sealing of a pact. At that exact moment, a colossal boom of thunder shook the tower to its core, rattling the iron sconces on the walls. The fire flared wildly in the hearth, casting a monstrous, dancing shadow of him against the wall. And then, a sound sharper and more terrifying than the thunder. Knock, knock, knock. 3 hard, commanding raps on the iron-strapped door. The sound cut through their fragile peace like a headsman's axe. "My lord?" Lord Valerius's voice came through the thick wood, cold and clipped, laced with suspicion. "I trust all is well?" There was a disturbance. Rhea froze, snatching her hand back from Alden's. Her blood ran cold. He had heard. Someone had heard. Alden's head snapped towards the door, his expression instantly hardening. The vulnerable man was gone, replaced by a flicker of the lord he was raised to be. He looked back at Rhea, his eyes wide in the firelight. For a split second, they were just 2 co-conspirators, caught in a dangerous act of truth. In his gaze, she saw a silent, urgent question. "Are you with me?" The air crackled, thick with unspoken questions, and the imminent threat on the other side of the door. Rhea's heart leaped into her throat, its frantic beat a wild drum against the sudden, suffocating silence. Valerius was there, the architect of this gilded cage, the keeper of the lie. She felt a primal urge to hide, to shrink into the shadows and disappear. But Alden's eyes were locked on hers, and in their depths, she saw not fear, but a nascent spark of defiance. He was asking for her allegiance, not just her silence. He rose slowly from his chair, a fluid movement that held a shadow of his forgotten grace. He was no longer the vulnerable patient. He was the lord of the tower, and Valerius was the intruder. He placed a single, steadying hand on her shoulder for a brief second, a silent command to stay calm, before turning to face the door. "Enter, Valerius," Alden's voice rang out, clear and controlled. It was still the smooth baritone of the man, but it carried a new edge of authority, a cold resonance that made the hairs on Rhea's arms stand on end. The heavy bolt slid back with a grating shriek, and the door swung inward. Lord Valerius stood silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor, his frame rigid, his face an unreadable mask of stone. Behind him, the two hulking guards shifted, their predatory energy flooding the room. Valerius's gaze swept the scene, the chairs pulled close to the hearth, the fallen book on the floor, the lingering intimacy in the air. His eyes, cold as a winter sea, finally settled on Rhea, and she felt herself flinch under the weight of his silent accusation. "We heard a noise," Valerius stated, his voice devoid of warmth. "A shout. I came to ensure Lord Marrow was not in distress." He was speaking to Alden, but his eyes were drilling into Rhea, demanding an explanation. Alden stepped forward, subtly positioning himself between Rhea and the regent, a protective gesture so instinctual he probably didn't even realize he was doing it. "A nightmare, Valerius. Nothing more." The lie was smooth, effortless. The storm unsettled my sleep. Valerius's nostrils flared. A minute, almost imperceptible movement. He was scenting the air, trying to read the truth in the currents of the room. He could smell the lingering spike of Alden's pain and Rhea's fear, a potent combination that would tell a story of its own. "Indeed," Valerius said slowly, his skepticism a palpable force. "And the scholar? Was her presence required to soothe this nightmare?" "Miss Lorne was reading to me. I find her voice helps to keep the shadows at bay," Alden replied, his tone dismissive, as if Valerius were a servant inquiring about a trivial matter. He walked over to the table and casually picked up a star chart, turning his back on the regent in a clear display of dominance. "You may go. Your concern is noted, but unnecessary." It was a gamble, a breathtaking display of authority from a man who wasn't supposed to remember what authority felt like. Rhea held her breath. For a long moment, Valerius simply stood there, his jaw tight. He was the regent, the acting alpha of the kingdom. He was not accustomed to being dismissed. A silent battle of wills was being fought in the charged space between the two men. The guards behind him tensed, their hands straying towards the pommels of their swords. Finally, with a stiff formal bow that was an insult in its brevity, Valerius conceded. "As you wish, my lord." He turned, but before he left, he shot one last, venomous glare at Rhea. It was a promise. "This is not over." The door boomed shut, and the bolt slid home once more. The sound, which had once felt like a prisoner's doom, now felt like a shield. Rhea let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding, her body trembling with residual adrenaline. "He knows," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He knows I failed." Alden turned from the table, his face grim. The facade of command had fallen away, leaving behind the weary, uncertain man. "He knows something changed between us," he corrected her quietly. He crossed the room and stood before her, his presence a comforting warmth against the chill of her fear. "He looks at you as if you are a weapon, and at me as if I am the fool who doesn't know how to wield it." He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently pick up the fallen book from the floor. He handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief, but it sent another jolt of awareness through her. "You were brave," he said, his voice low and sincere. "When I was lost in the pain, you did not run. You anchored me. I was terrified," she admitted, clutching the book to her chest. "I broke his most important rule." "And you found a truth he has been trying to bury," he countered, his gaze intense. "Rhea, what I felt tonight, it was more than a phantom. It was real. A part of me, sleeping. Your story woke it up." He looked down at his own hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. "All my life, or what I can remember of it, I have felt like a fraud, a man playing a part he was never cast for. Tonight, for the first time, I felt whole. Even in the pain, there was a sense of completeness." The rain continued to beat against the window, a steady, rhythmic drumming that seemed to count out the seconds of their stolen time. The fire had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows that made the vast room feel smaller, more intimate. "Valerius wants me to be a quiet, broken lord who is content with star charts and ancient history," Alden continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He wants a king in name, but a puppet in practice. But he made a mistake. He brought you here." He stepped closer, his sincerity wrapping around her like a cloak. "He thought you would be a simple distraction, a narrator of dead histories. He didn't realize he was bringing me a key." "A key to what?" she breathed, her heart aching at the hope in his voice. To the man I was. His gaze was unwavering. You will not be punished for this. I will not allow it. From now on, you are not just my scholar. You are my confidant. We will uncover this mystery together. It was a declaration, a promise, and a terrifying invitation. To align herself with him was to declare herself an enemy of Valerius and the entire power structure that was holding the kingdom together. She was just an Omega scholar. She had no power, no allies. Her only weapon was knowledge, and even that was being censored and controlled. But as she looked into his earnest, searching eyes, she knew she had already made her choice. She had made it the moment she knelt before him and talked him through the storm in his own soul. Her loyalty was no longer to the regent who had sent her here, but to the broken king who was trying to find his way home. "All right," she whispered, the single word a vow. A slow smile spread across Alden's face, transforming his features. It was the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, and it was devastating. It erased the shadows of confusion and pain, revealing a warmth and charisma that had likely charmed armies and swayed councils. In that smile, she saw a glimpse of the king he had been, and the man he could be again. "Then our lessons will have to change," he said, his voice lighter than she had ever heard it. He gestured to the shelves of approved, ancient histories. "No more stories of the first men. I want to know what happened 10 years ago. 20. I want to know about the reign of the king before me. His name was King Theron. Your father," she supplied softly. "My father," he repeated, testing the word. A shadow of pain crossed his face, a grief for a man he couldn't remember. "Tell me about him." And so, she did. Seated by the dying fire, with the storm as their only witness, she began to weave the truth back into his life, piece by careful piece. She told him of his father's reign, of the treaties he'd signed, of the way he had been loved by the northern clans. She avoided the specifics of his death, the details of Alden's own bloody ascension, and anything to do with the true nature of their people. She was still walking a knife's edge, but now, she was walking it with him. He listened, hanging on her every word. He was not just a student now, he was a detective, piecing together the puzzle of his own life. As she spoke, she saw flickers of recognition, of connection. A name would make him frown. A description of a banner would make him glance towards the unadorned stone walls. Hours passed. The storm quieted to a gentle, steady drumming. The fire burned down to glowing embers. Rhea's voice grew hoarse, but she didn't stop. She was giving him back his past, his identity, and in doing so, she was inextricably weaving herself into it. Finally, her words trailed off. The silence that fell was comfortable, companionable. Alden was staring into the embers, his face thoughtful. "He sent you here to be my jailer," Alden said quietly, his gaze still on the fire. "To keep my mind in a prison of the distant past." He turned to look at her, the red glow of the coals reflected in his eyes, making them seem darker, more intense. "But instead, you are setting me free." He reached out and gently took the book from her lap, setting it aside. Then, he took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His palm was warm, calloused, strong. It was a hand that knew the weight of a sword, even if his mind did not. "Rhea," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur that was meant only for her. "I know I am not the man I once was. I have no memories of my past, no crown, no power. All I have is this room, and these questions." He lifted her hand, his gaze dropping to their joined fingers, then rising to meet hers again. "And you," her breath caught. His thumb stroked the sensitive skin of her wrist, sending a cascade of warmth through her veins. The air between them grew heavy, thick with unspoken emotions. This was no longer about a king and his scholar. This was about a man and a woman, alone in the heart of a storm. He leaned in, his movement slow, deliberate, giving her every chance to pull away. The scent of him, that confusing, intoxicating mix of pine, storm, and warm, living man filled her senses. His gaze dropped to her lips. "What happens?" he whispered, his own voice unsteady for the first time, "when a prisoner begins to fall for his jailer?" The world narrowed, to the space between their faces, to the heat of his palm against hers, to the question that hung in the air like a suspended breath. His words wrapped around Rhea's heart. A dangerous, beautiful admission, that shattered the last of her carefully constructed defenses. She was no jailer. She was a fellow prisoner, and she was falling just as fast. Her lips parted to answer. To say what? She didn't know that she was not his jailer, that she felt it too, that this was madness. But no words came. His gaze held her captive, a silent conversation passing between them that was more honest than any words they could have spoken. It was a shared acknowledgement of their impossible situation, of the fragile, powerful thing growing between them. In the silent heart of the tower, he leaned closer, closing the final inch. The scent of him was overwhelming now, seeping into her, marking her. Wood smoke, warm skin, and that ever-present ghost of pine and storm. His eyes were dark pools in the dying firelight, reflecting the embers and her own wide-eyed face. She saw her own longing mirrored there, her own fear. His lips brushed against hers, a touch as soft and tentative as a moth's wing. It was not a kiss of passion or possession, but one of profound, searching tenderness. A question, a plea, a discovery. It was a human kiss, full of hesitation and wonder, and it undid her completely. A small, involuntary sigh escaped her, and in response, he deepened the kiss ever so slightly. It was still gentle, but it was no longer tentative. It was acclaiming, a quiet statement of fact in a world built on lies. Her mind screamed warnings, the image of Valerius's cold fury flashing behind her closed eyes, but her body, her heart, her very soul, leaned into the warmth. She felt his other hand come up to cup her jaw, his thumb stroking the line of her cheekbone. Her own hand, the one not held captive in his, rose to rest on his chest, right over his heart. It beat a strong, steady, singular rhythm against her palm. The kiss was everything. It was comfort and danger, solace and treason. It was the sealing of their secret alliance, a pact made not in words but in the silent language of touch. He broke the kiss slowly, resting his forehead against hers. They breathed the same air, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. His eyes, when he opened them, were dark with an emotion she couldn't name, a potent mixture of awe, gratitude, and a sorrow so deep it stole her breath. Raya. He whispered her name like a prayer. Before either of them could say another word, a new sound intruded, pulling them from their trance. It was faint at first, a distant, mournful cry that seemed to rise from the very stones of the mountains. A woo. The howl. Alden went rigid. He pulled back, his head snapping towards the great window. The sound came again, closer this time, joined by another, then another, until the night air was filled with a chorus of wild, lonely voices. The pack was calling. "What is that?" he asked, his voice tight, a strange mix of fear and an unnerving, resonant familiarity. Raya's blood turned to ice. She had been so lost in him she had forgotten. The full moon was only 2 nights away. The packs would be growing restless, their instincts rising with the tide of lunar power. "Wolves," she said, the forbidden word tasting like ash on her tongue. It was a partial truth. They were not common wolves. He moved to the window, drawn by a force he didn't understand. Raya followed, her heart pounding a heavy, fearful rhythm. He stood before the vast expanse of glass, staring out into the rain-washed darkness, where the mountains were jagged black teeth against a faintly luminous, cloud-shrouded sky. The moonlight was diffuse, but it was there, a cold silver glow filtering through the storm. "They sound," he trailed off, pressing a hand against the cool glass. "They sound like they're in pain." "They are. Singing to the moon," she whispered, standing a few feet behind him. "Singing?" He turned to look at her, his brows furrowed in confusion. "It doesn't sound like a song. It sounds like a lament, a longing for something they've lost." His words struck her with the force of a physical blow. He was describing the very essence of their kind, the eternal push and pull between man and beast, the yearning for the freedom of the hunt and the bond of the pack. He was describing himself, and he didn't even know it. A tremor ran through him, a violent shudder that shook his entire frame. He gritted his teeth, his knuckles white where his hand was pressed against the window. "That sound," he grated. "It's inside my head. It's pulling at something." His breath began to fog the glass. The air in the room grew thick, charged with a wild, static energy. The dormant power within him, the sleeping alpha wolf, was stirring in response to the call of its kind. The story had woken it. The kiss had coaxed it. And now the moon was calling it. "Alden," she said, her voice tight with a new, urgent fear. "Come away from the window." He didn't seem to hear her. His gaze was fixed on the unseen landscape. "I know this mountain," he murmured, his voice taking on a strange, distant quality. "I've run these ridges. I've tasted the wind at the summit." His eyes, which had been a clear, human brown, seemed to darken, a faint, almost imperceptible golden light beginning to glow in their depths, like embers being fanned by a rising wind. "My lord, please," Rhea begged, reaching for his arm. The moment her fingers touched his skin, he flinched as if burned. He spun around to face her, and the man she had kissed was gone. His face was a mask of primal fury and agonizing confusion. The golden flecks in his eyes were brighter now, swirling in the brown irises. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that was not human, a sound that vibrated through the floor and up into Rhea's bones. "What is happening to me?" he roared, the sound deeper, rougher than his normal voice. He backed away from her, clutching his head. "What have you done?" "I've done nothing," she cried, her own fear making her voice sharp. "This is you. This is what Valerius has been trying to suppress." "Lies," he snarled, and the word was a feral sound. He began to pace the room like a caged animal, his movements no longer the constrained steps of a man, but the fluid, predatory stride of a wolf. "You're one of them." The whispers in the halls, the guards with their glowing eyes. "You're all part of this madness." He was connecting the dots, his fractured memory and his rising instincts warring for control. The carefully constructed reality they had built for him was shattering. Rhea stood her ground, her terror warring with a desperate need to reach him. "Alden, listen to me. This is not madness. It is your nature. My nature is not to be a beast." He slammed his fist against the stone wall, the impact echoing like a gunshot. The stones didn't even chip. He stared at his hand, at the unbloodied knuckles, a flicker of shock on his face. He was stronger than a human should be. He was healing faster than a human could. The howls outside rose in a crescendo, a final, powerful call to the hidden moon. In response, Alden cried out, a raw sound of pure agony, and collapsed to his knees. His body was contorting, his back arching. He clawed at his own shirt, tearing the fabric, his muscles twisting and bunching beneath his skin in unnatural ways. "It's trying to get out," he gasped, his face slick with sweat, his eyes screwed shut in pain. "Gods, help me, it's trying to break free." Rhea rushed to him, her scholarly caution obliterated by a fierce, undeniable love. She knelt in front of him, grabbing his face between her hands, forcing him to look at her. His eyes were blazing, now, more gold than brown, the pupils dilating and contracting with a feral light. "Fight it, Alden," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Don't let it take you. It doesn't remember you. It only remembers the power, the rage." The ritual had not just severed his connection to the wolf. It had damaged the wolf itself. If it broke free now, without his human consciousness to temper it, it would be nothing but a mindless, savage beast. It would be the Alpha King in all his terrifying, primal glory, with none of the man she had come to love. It would not recognize her. It would tear her apart, and then the tower, and then it would bring the kingdom to its knees in a torrent of blood and chaos. His gaze locked on hers. Through the haze of pain and feral instinct, a flicker of the man remained. He saw her. He saw her fear, not of him, but for him. "Rhea," he groaned, his voice a strained, broken thing. He was fighting. For her. His hands came up to grip her wrists. His strength immense, terrifying. His fingernails seemed to thicken, to sharpen, digging into her skin. But it wasn't an attack. It was an anchor. He was holding on to her, the one real thing in his world, as the tide of his own monstrous nature tried to pull him under. "Don't let me go," he snarled, the words a mix of human plea and wolfish command. Outside, the last howl faded into the night, leaving an echoing, profound silence. The pressure in the room, the wild, chaotic energy, began to recede. The golden light in Alden's eyes flickered, dimmed. The unnatural tension in his body eased. He slumped forward, his forehead coming to rest against hers, his body trembling with the aftermath. He was still holding her wrists, his grip crushingly tight. His breathing was harsh, ragged. He smelled of sweat and fear, and the wild, ozonic scent of a storm that had passed. For a long moment, they stayed like that, locked together in the ruins of his control. He had fought it back. He had won, for now. He slowly released her wrists, his hands falling away. When he lifted his head, his eyes were brown again, clear and human, but they were filled with a new, soul-shattering horror. He had seen the beast within. He had felt its claws on the inside of his own skin. He looked at her, at the red marks on her wrists where his nails had dug in, at her terrified, tear-streaked face. The realization of what he was, and what he had almost done, crashed down on him. "The monster," he whispered, his voice hollow with dawning dread. "The monster they've been hiding from me." He looked at his own hands as if they were weapons. "It's me." The silence that followed his whispered confession was heavier than the stone walls, deeper than the mountain valleys outside. It was a silence filled with the ghost of a growl, the memory of glowing eyes, and the chilling truth that could no longer be denied. Alden stared at his hands, then at her, his face a mask of dawning horror. The king, the man, the lover, all of them were eclipsed by this new, terrifying identity, the monster. Rhea's own terror was a cold knot in her stomach, but seeing the utter self-revulsion on his face ignited a fierce, protective fire within her. She would not let him drown in that belief. She had seen the beast, yes, but she had also seen the man who had fought it back. "That was not you," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She reached out, her fingers gently covering his hand where it lay on his knee. His skin was feverishly hot. "That was an echo, a part of you that is in pain and confusion. It's a storm, Alden, and storms pass." "A storm?" He pulled his hand away as if her touch burned him, scrambling back until his shoulders hit the cold stone of the hearth. He looked trapped, cornered by his own body. "A storm doesn't have claws, Rhea. It doesn't have fangs. I felt them, inside me, wanting to tear, to rip, to hunt." His gaze flickered, towards her, and she saw a profound, gut-wrenching fear in his eyes. He wasn't afraid of the beast. He was afraid of what the beast wanted to do to her. He had felt the predator, and she was its prey. "You fought it," she insisted, her voice rising with desperate sincerity. "You heard the call, and you felt the change, but you fought it. You held on, to me." She held up her wrists, showing him the angry red crescents his nails had left. "This is not the mark of a monster. This is the mark of the man who won." He stared at the marks, and his expression crumpled. The horror was replaced by a wave of guilt so potent it was a physical force. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "Gods," he choked out, the sound muffled. "I hurt you." The quiet agony in those 3 words shattered what was left of her composure. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the sight of the broken man before her. He was not a monster. He was a good man terrified of a power he had been born to wield, a power he had been taught to forget. She moved across the floor on her knees and, with a hesitation that felt like stepping off a cliff, she wrapped her arms around him. He went rigid at first, his whole body a knot of resistance. She held on, resting her cheek against his trembling back, her tears soaking into the torn fabric of his shirt. "You did not hurt me," she whispered against his skin. "You saved me. You saved us both." Slowly, hesitantly, the tension began to seep out of him. He let out a long, shuddering breath, and his hands came up to cover hers where they were clasped over his chest. He leaned into her embrace, a silent, desperate surrender. For a long time, they knelt there in the dying firelight, 2 broken people holding each other together in the face of a terrifying truth. "You have to tell me everything," he finally said, his voice ragged, thick with unshed tears. "No more stories, no more careful omissions. I need to know what I rated." And so, she told him. She started with the word shifter, explaining the dual nature of their people, the bond between human and wolf. She explained the hierarchy, the alphas, the betas, the omegas. She watched his face as she spoke, saw the flicker of understanding, the dawning recognition, the puzzle pieces of his life, the strange instincts, the phantom memories, the deference of the guards began to click into place. She told him about the packs, the territories, the uneasy peace that governed the continent. And then, she told him about himself. She spoke of Alden Marrow, the Alpha King of the North, the Iron Wolf, the most powerful shifter of his generation. She described his reign, his strength, the respect and fear he commanded. He listened without interruption, his face pale, his eyes wide with a kind of terrified awe. He was listening to the biography of a stranger, a mythic figure he could not connect with, the broken man huddled on the floor. The ritual, he finally whispered when she paused. Valerius mentioned a ritual. Rhea's heart clenched. This was the hardest part. You believed you could harness the power of the blood moon, she explained, her voice low. It's a celestial event of immense power, one that can amplify an alpha's abilities 100-fold. You and the royal healers, you attempted a rite to draw that power directly into yourself, to bind it to your bloodline forever, to become a god among wolves. His expression hardened. Arrogance. Power, she corrected gently. You wanted to secure the kingdom for generations, to end the threat of rival packs permanently. But something went wrong. The power was too vast, too wild. It didn't bind to you. It broke you. It shattered the bridge between your mind and your wolf, erasing your memories and silencing the beast within. He absorbed this, his gaze distant. So the wolf is in there, he mused, a strange clinical detachment in his AI voice as he touched a hand to his own chest. A king without a crown, a prisoner in my own flesh. He looked at her. And Valerius? Why this elaborate lie? Because the beast that is sleeping inside you is not the same one that fell, she said, her voice dropping ominously. The healers believe the ritual corrupted it. Without your human consciousness, your memories, your soul, to guide it, it is nothing but rage and instinct, a mindless weapon. Valerius fears that if it wakes, it will not recognize friend from foe. It will only recognize threats, and it will eliminate them, and I am the greatest threat to his regency. Alden finished, the pieces falling into place with chilling clarity. If I remember who I am, I will challenge him. If the beast wakes, it may destroy everything. He has me perfectly trapped. He let out a bitter, humorless laugh. So he keeps me calm, docile, a human lord in a tower, reading books with a quiet Omega scholar. His eyes met hers, and the bitter amusement faded, replaced by a dawning, fierce intelligence that she recognized from the legends. The king was beginning to surface, but he didn't count on the scholar having a spine. Alden murmured, a flicker of a smile touching his lips. And he didn't count on the monster, falling in love with her. The words, spoken so plainly, so matter-of-factly, stole the air from her lungs. It wasn't a question this time. It was a statement. He was claiming not only his monstrous nature, but the human heart that beat alongside it. Alden, she breathed, her own heart aching with the beauty and the tragedy of it all. He is afraid of the beast, Alden continued, his voice gaining strength, conviction. He rose to his feet, pulling her up with him. He held her hands, his grip firm, his gaze boring into hers. But I am not anymore. You were right. I fought it. Which means it can be fought, it can be controlled, it can be tamed. A new, terrifying hope began to dawn. What are you saying? I am saying this prison has an exit, he declared, a fire igniting in his eyes, a fire that was all man, all king. The full moon. You said it was in 2 nights. Yes, she whispered, dread coiling in her gut. It is the apex of a shifter's power. It will be the hardest time to fight the change. Or, he countered, his voice dropping, alive with a sudden brilliant idea, it is the best time to force a reconciliation. The bridge between me and my wolf is broken. The moon's power might be strong enough to rebuild it. Or it could shatter you completely, she cried, horrified. Alden, no. The ritual almost killed you. A forced shift now. In your condition, you could be lost forever. The man could die, leaving only the beast. The man is already dead if he stays in this tower. He shot back, his intensity unwavering. Living a lie, afraid of his own shadow. I would rather be destroyed, reaching for my whole self, than live as half a man, a puppet for Valerius. He framed her face with his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. His touch was no longer hesitant. It was possessive protective, the touch of an alpha. I will not be that mindless rage, Rhea, because now, the beast has something to remember. It has you. He leaned down and captured her lips in a kiss that was nothing like the first. There was no hesitation now, no gentle discovery. This was a kiss of fire and desperation, of claiming and being claimed. It was a promise of a battle to come, a declaration of what he was fighting for. He poured all of his fear, his hope, his newfound love for her into that kiss. He was memorizing her, branding her onto his soul, so that even if the beast rose, it would remember the scent of her, the taste of her, the feel of her hands in his. She was his anchor, his humanity. When he finally broke the kiss, they were both breathless. The air around them thrummed with a new energy, not the chaotic, feral power from before, but the sharp, focused energy of purpose, of a king who had just found his cause. 2 nights, he said, his voice a low, determined growl. Help me, Rhea. Help me prepare. Tell me everything you know about the shift, about control, about the bond. He was no longer Alden Marrow, the lost lord. He was the Iron Wolf, waking from his slumber, and he was asking her to stand with him at the heart of the coming storm. To save the man, she would have to help him unleash the very beast that could destroy them all. He looked past her, towards the great window. The clouds had finally broken, and through a gap, a sliver of the waxing gibbous moon cast a blade of pure, silver light across the stone floor. It fell upon them, anointing them. Alden's eyes, fixed on the moonlight, began to glow again, but this time, it was not a feral, uncontrolled fire. It was a focused, determined glint of pure, terrifying gold. It's time, he whispered, his voice a low rumble that was no longer entirely human, to remind them who I am. The next 48 hours were a blur of stolen moments and whispered secrets, a frantic race against the rising moon. The tower, once a quiet cage, became a war room. The gilded prison transformed into a training ground for the most dangerous battle of Alden's life, the fight for his own soul. There was no more reading of ancient histories. The only text they studied now was the one written in his blood and bone. Rhea became his teacher, his guide, his memory. She dredged up every piece of lore she had ever read, every whispered story she had ever overheard about the nature of the shift. She spoke of the focal points, the emotional anchors shifters used to tether their human minds during the violent transformation. For most, it was the pack, the territory, the Alpha's command. Alden had none of those. You will only have me, she told him, her voice quiet but steady as they sat on the floor, the pale morning light streaming through the window. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp. When the change comes, when the pain starts, you cannot think of the wolf. You must think of me, my face, my voice, the scent of the library on my skin. He nodded, his focus absolute. The lost, confused man was gone, replaced by a warrior sharpening his blades for combat. He absorbed her words, his sharp mind dissecting every detail. The scent, he repeated, his gaze intense. It is the strongest sense for the wolf, is it not? Yes, she confirmed. Scent is memory. It is identity. Without a word, he reached for her, pulling her close. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling deeply. His breath was warm against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine that was equal parts fear and a dizzying, primal thrill. He was not just a man breathing in a woman's perfume. He was an alpha, memorizing the scent of his mate, branding it onto his awakening instincts. Old paper, he murmured against her throat. Dried ink. And something else, like wildflowers after rain. He pulled back, his golden-flecked eyes locking with hers. I will not forget it. The intimacy between them deepened, forged in the crucible of their shared, desperate purpose. Every touch, every glance was now laden with a new weight. When she handed him a cup of water, his fingers would linger on hers, a silent acknowledgement of their bond. When he paced the room, wrestling with the phantom urges that now flickered beneath his skin, she would stand near, a quiet, steady presence that calmed the rising storm within him. They spoke of Valerius and his motivations. Alden, with the fragments of his kingly instincts returning, saw the regent's plan with chilling clarity. He doesn't want me dead, Alden mused, staring into the hearth as if seeing the future in its flames. A dead king is a martyr. He wants me broken. A tame, human figurehead he can control. It gives his rule legitimacy. He looked at Rhea. But if the beast emerges without me to control it? A mindless, rabid alpha king running rampant? That would force the conclave to act. They would have no choice but to put the monster down and officially recognize Valerius as the new alpha king to restore order. He wins either way. So we cannot let the beast win, Rhea whispered. No, Alden's voice was a low growl. We let the king win. On the day of the full moon, a suffocating tension descended upon the tower. Alden felt it most acutely. He was restless, pacing the room like a caged panther, his muscles coiled tight. A fine sheen of sweat coated his skin, and the golden flecks in his eyes were a permanent, burning presence now. He ate nothing, his senses too heightened for food. He could hear the heartbeats of the guards in the corridor, could smell the snow on the distant peaks. His body was preparing for the change, with or without his consent. Rhea felt it too, a low thrumming in her own blood, the ancient Omega instinct to submit, to calm, to nurture. She fought it, forcing herself to remain his equal, his strategist. To yield now would be to treat him as a beast, when he needed her to see him as a man. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, painting the snow-capped mountains in hues of violet and blood orange, Alden stopped his pacing. He stood before the great window, his back to her. "It's time," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. He turned, and the sight of him stole her breath. He had stripped off his shirt. In the fading light, his torso was a landscape of muscle and old scars, each one a testament to a battle he couldn't remember. He was magnificent, terrifying, and achingly human. "Whatever happens, Rhea," he said, his voice a low, raw command. "Do not run." "I won't," she promised, her heart hammering against her ribs. He walked to the center of the room and knelt on the cold flagstones, assuming a meditative posture. He closed his eyes, his breathing deep and even. He was not going to fight the change with brute force. He was going to meet it with the full strength of his human will. He was going to guide the storm. Rhea sat a few feet away, her own hands clenched in her lap. She was his anchor, and she had to be stronger than the tide. The first rays of moonlight, pure and silver, spilled through the window. They touched the stone floor, inching their way towards him like a predator. The moment the light touched his skin, he gasped, his body arching in a silent scream. His eyes snapped open, and they were no longer brown with flecks of gold. They were molten, blazing gold. The wolf was awake. A guttural snarl tore from his throat, a sound that was pure beast. His muscles began to writhe and contort under his skin, the sounds of popping joints and stretching ligaments filling the room. It was a horrifying, unnatural symphony of transformation. "Alden!" Rhea cried out, her voice sharp, a lifeline in the sea of his agony. "I am here. Find me!" He thrashed on the floor, his human form fighting a losing battle against the primal power erupting within. His spine elongated, his shoulders broadened, his features began to distend. Dark, coarse fur sprouted along his arms and back. "Rhea," he groaned, the name a mangled, desperate sound, half human, half beast. He was trying, he was fighting, he was looking for her in the hurricane of instinct. "I'm here," she repeated, forcing herself to stay seated, to be the calm center of his storm. Remember the library, the smell of old paper. Remember the rain. A full-throated howl of pure, unadulterated agony ripped from him as his bones broke and reformed. He was on all fours now, his body a horrifying mockery of both man and wolf. The change was stalling, caught between two natures. The beast wanted release, and the man refused to let go. The conflict was tearing him apart. His heart was beating that chaotic, two-souled rhythm, a wild drumbeat of war. "I can't," he snarled, his voice a deep, demonic rumble. He lifted his head, and his face was a terrifying, half-shifted mask of fury. His teeth had elongated into fangs, and his golden eyes were wild with a rage that was not his own. It was the corrupted, mindless beast Valerius had feared, and it was looking straight at her. It saw her not as an anchor, but as a cage, the source of its conflict, the thing holding it back from its true, savage form. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the tower, the beast lunged, not at the door, not at the window, at her. Time seemed to slow. Rhea saw the fury in its eyes, the saliva dripping from its fangs, the claws that were not yet fully formed but were already lethal. The Omega in her screamed, a primal, terrified instinct to flee, to submit, to die. Do not run. Alden's words echoed in her mind. She held her ground, her gaze locked on the monstrous form hurtling towards her. She did not see a beast. She saw Alden, trapped, screaming, lost in the inferno of his own power. Instead of running away, she did the one thing the beast would never expect, the one thing that defied all logic, all instinct for self-preservation. She opened her arms. Just as he was about to crash into her, a different scent hit his senses, cutting through the red haze of fury. Not just her scent, but the scent of her absolute, unconditional surrender, her complete and utter trust. It was not the scent of prey, it was the scent of a mate. He skidded to a halt on the flagstones, the sound of his claws scraping against the stone a piercing shriek. He was inches from her, looming over her, a massive, half-shifted creature of nightmare. A low, confused growl rumbled in his chest. His feral mind could not compute her actions. "Alden," she whispered, her voice shaking but clear, her arms still open in invitation. "Come back." He stared at her, his golden eyes swirling with a maelstrom of conflict. The beast saw a threat to be neutralized. The corrupted wolf saw a cage to be broken. But somewhere, deep within that inferno, the king heard her. The man remembered her. The soul recognized its anchor. With a final, soul-tearing cry that was a mixture of a man's scream and a wolf's howl, he collapsed. He didn't fall forward into her arms, but sideways, crashing to the floor in a heap of trembling limbs and half-formed fur. The violent energy receded, the transformation reversing itself with agonizing slowness. The fur retreated, the bones settled, the fangs shortened. By the time it was over, he lay naked and shivering on the cold stone, curled in on himself, completely human. His eyes were closed, his face pale and streaked with tears and sweat. His breathing was shallow. He was utterly spent, broken by the battle he had both won and lost. Rhea scrambled to his side, pulling a fur blanket from the bed and wrapping it around his trembling form. She cradled his head in her lap, stroking his damp hair. His skin was cold, clammy. "Alden?" she whispered, her own tears falling freely onto his face. "Are you there?" His eyelids fluttered open. His eyes were a clear, deep brown. No gold, no fire. They were the eyes of the man she had met, the man she had fallen in love with. But they were filled with a profound, desolate emptiness. He looked at her, and his lips formed her name, but no sound came out. The dawn was breaking. Pale, rosy light began to creep into the room, chasing away the last of the moon's silver glow. The night was over. The battle was done. A key scraped in the lock. Rhea's head snapped up, her heart seizing with a new cold dread. The heavy door swung open. Lord Valerius stood there, flanked by his 2 guards. His face was a thundercloud of fury and disbelief. He had clearly come expecting to find a scene of carnage, a mindless beast to be put down. Instead, he found her, cradling the still, human form of his king. Valerius's cold eyes swept over the scene, the torn shirt, the scrape marks on the floor, the exhausted, vulnerable man in her arms. He understood instantly. They had not just survived the night. They had defied him. His gaze settled on Rhea, and the look in his eyes was pure venom. "You," he hissed, the word a blade of ice. "You have ruined everything." He took a step into the room, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. But before he could take another, a voice, weak but clear, cut through the air. "Valerius!" Alden was pushing himself up, leaning heavily on Rhea. He was weak, drained, but he was awake. He looked at the regent, and for the first time, there was no confusion in his eyes, only the cold, hard certainty of a king. "Leave her," he commanded, his voice a raw whisper that held the iron weight of a crown. "Your quarrel is with me." 1 year later, the air in the royal solar no longer tasted of iron and fear, but of sun-warmed stone, beeswax, and the familiar, comforting scent of old parchment. Sunlight, thick and golden, streamed through the open doors of a wide balcony, illuminating the swirling dust motes like a galaxy of tiny stars. Rhea sat in a high-backed chair, not a history of forgotten men open on her lap, but a treaty document, its ink still fresh. Her plain woolen dress had been replaced by a simple but elegant gown of forest green, the color of new life. She was no longer a shadow in the halls. She was a presence. A sound, softer than a whisper, drew her from her work. She looked up. Alden stood in the doorway, leaning against the ancient stone, simply watching her. He moved with a quiet, fluid grace now, a perfect synthesis of the man and the wolf. He was not one or the other, but something new, something more. The restless, caged energy was gone, replaced by a profound and settled strength that emanated from him like warmth from a fire. "Your brow is furrowed, my love," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble. "Are the trade emissaries from the south proving troublesome again?" Rhea smiled, a soft, genuine expression that was no longer a stranger to her face. "They are merely loud. They use too many words to say too little." He crossed the room in a few silent strides, his bare feet making no sound on the stone floor. He knelt before her, taking the treaty document from her hands and setting it aside. He took her fingers in his touch a familiar, grounding pressure. His eyes, a clear, warm brown, now held a permanent, knowing glint of gold in their depths, like sunlight on a forest pool. "The wolf agrees," he murmured, a hint of amusement in his tone. "He says their scent is dishonest. Too much sweet wine, not enough steel." It was how he spoke of it now, not as the beast or the monster, but simply as the wolf. It was not a separate entity to be feared, but his other half, his partner. The night of the full moon had not destroyed him, nor had it seamlessly healed him. It had forced a truce. Alden, the man, was in control, his will and his heart the dominant force. But the wolf was always there, a silent passenger, lending its senses, its instincts, its primal wisdom. He had not conquered the beast. He had learned its language. "And what does the king say?" Rhea asked, lacing her fingers through his. "The king says he is grateful his queen has the patience to deal with them, so he does not have to." He leaned forward and kissed her, a deep, lingering kiss filled with the easy intimacy of 1,000 others that had passed between them. It was a kiss that tasted of home. The confrontation with Valerius had been swift and silent. There had been no grand trial, no public execution. Alden, leaning on Rhea for support, had faced him down, not with a roar, but with a quiet, unshakable authority. He had not stripped Valerius of his titles in anger, but had simply told him the truth. The kingdom had no place for a wolf who feared the moon. Valerius and his most loyal followers were exiled, sent to the barren southern coasts under a pact of permanent peace. It was an act of mercy, but also a show of immense power. Alden didn't need to kill his enemies anymore. He simply needed to lead. His memories had returned in flashes and waves in the weeks that followed. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like a shattered mosaic being reassembled. Each memory was now tinged with the new perspective he had gained during his time as a broken, human man. He remembered the arrogance that led him to the blood moon ritual, and he felt not pride, but a sobering humility. He remembered the wars he had fought, and he felt not the glory, but the weight of the lives lost. He was a better king for having forgotten how to be one. "I heard the guards talking this morning," Rhea said softly, her thumb stroking the back of his hand, tracing the line of a pale silver scar. "They say a white stag has been seen in the northern woods, a sign of great prosperity." Alden's nostrils flared, a subtle instinctual movement. "I can smell the change in the wind. The herds are healthy, the rivers are full, the land is at peace." He looked out towards the balcony, towards the sprawling city and the green lands beyond. "It is a peace we built." He rose, pulling her gently to her feet. He led her out onto the balcony, into the warm afternoon sun. The capital city spread out below them, bustling with life. The air smelled of wood smoke, baking bread, and the distant, clean scent of the mountains that had once been his prison. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned her head back against his shoulder, closing her eyes. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart against her back. It was a singular beat, strong and true. The frantic, warring cadence was a distant memory, a ghost of a storm that had long since passed. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "The silence? The simple life of a man with no memory?" He was quiet for a long moment, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I miss the man who was free to fall in love with his scholar without the weight of a crown," he admitted, his voice a low vibration against her. "But I would not trade this for anything." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "That man was only half a soul. You made me whole, Rhea. You did not just save me from the beast. You saved the beast from its rage. You taught a king his own heart." Rhea turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to cup his jaw. She looked into his eyes, into the soul of the man and the spirit of the wolf, and saw only love. She was not just a queen, not just an advisor, not just a mate. She was his anchor, his partner in a kingdom built not on fear or brute strength, but on the union of two disparate souls. "And you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, taught a quiet scholar that her voice was strong enough to calm a storm. The sun began to dip towards the jagged peaks of the mountains, painting the sky in fiery colors. The first star of evening pricked the darkening violet canvas. In the distance, rising from the deep woods, a single, clear howl echoed through the twilight. It was not a sound of pain or loneliness. It was a song of contentment, of territory held, of a pack that was whole. Alden did not flinch. He did not tremble. He simply smiled, a soft, knowing expression on his face, and pulled her closer. The full moon would rise soon, a pearl in the velvet sky. It was no longer a threat. It was a promise, a reminder of the night a broken king remembered his name, and a forgotten Omega claimed her heart. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. They stood together as one, the Alpha King and his scholar queen, their two hearts beating in a quiet, perfect rhythm, the steady, unwavering pulse of their new world.